On the night of Good Friday, April 4th, 1958, police were called to a house on North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills. Inside, a man was dead on the floor of the bedroom. The woman who lived there, one of the most famous actresses in the world, was sitting nearby in a state of shock. Her 14-year-old daughter had just done something that would make the front page of every newspaper in America. The woman was Lana Turner, and this was not even the most troubled chapter of her life. 8 marriages, 7 different men, a childhood carved out of poverty and violence, a Hollywood career that made her one of the highest-paid women in the country, and a personal life so relentlessly dramatic that even the people who lived through it had trouble believing it was real. This is not a story about glamour. It is a story about a woman who spent her entire life chasing something: security, love, stability, and never quite reaching it, no matter how many times she tried. Idaho, loss, and a girl named Judy. To understand anything about Lana Turner's life, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is not glamorous. She was born Julia Jean Turner on February 8th, 1921, in Wallace, Idaho, a small mining town tucked into the mountains of the Silver Valley, where the winters were long and the economy ran on hard labor and not much else. Her father, John Virgil Turner, was a miner and occasional gambler and bootlegger. Her mother, Mildred, was 15 years old when she eloped with John after he returned from military service. She was barely an adult when Lana was born. The family moved around a great deal in Lana's early years, following the work and the circumstances, as families in that part of the country often did during the late 1920s. By the time Lana was old enough to have clear memories, the family had relocated to San Francisco. Her parents separated there, not in a clean or resolved way, but in the fractured, grinding manner of people who have run out of options and patience simultaneously. Her father continued his restless pattern of gambling and odd work. Her mother tried to keep them both afloat. And then something happened that changed everything. On the night of December 14th, 1930, John Virgil Turner had a very good night at a card game. He walked away with considerable winnings, reportedly stuffed into his left stocking for safekeeping. He never made it home. He was beaten and robbed in the street, and he died from his injuries. Lana was 9 years old. The murder was never solved. Nobody was ever charged. The man who had given her a name and a childhood simply disappeared from the world one night and left a wound that had no proper edges. The loss of her father hollowed out what remained of the family's stability. Mildred was a young widow. She had been barely a teenager herself when she married. With a daughter to raise and almost no money, she worked long hours as a beautician to keep them going, sometimes putting in what amounted to 80 hours a week in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, working as much as she could to keep them from drowning. Because of those hours, and because there was no one to look after Lana, she spent periods of her childhood in foster homes while her mother worked. Those years were not easy. There were accounts, confirmed in later years, that she was subjected to mistreatment in at least one of those placements. Physical and emotional harm at the hands of people who were supposed to be providing care. She did not speak about it often or in great detail, but what she did say suggested it left its mark. When you grow up with that as your foundation, a murdered father, a struggling mother, homes where you weren't safe, you learn certain things about how much you can count on permanence. You either build very thick walls, or you spend your life throwing yourself at the next person who offers warmth. Lana Turner, for most of her adult life, did the latter. By the time she was 10 or 11, she and her mother had moved to Los Angeles, following the promise of steadier work and a warmer climate. Prohibition was ending. The speakeasies where Mildred had sometimes worked as a singer were shutting down, and California seemed like the logical next stop. They settled modestly in the Hollywood area. Mildred continued working as a beautician. Lana enrolled at Hollywood High School, where she was, by most accounts, a reasonably average student with no particular sense of where her life was headed. She was a teenager who had already lived through more than most adults. She carried it quietly, the way people from hard places learn to do. She had not planned to be an actress. As a young girl, she had apparently imagined becoming a fashion designer, or, in the more religious phases of her childhood, a nun. Acting was not something she thought about. It was something that happened to her on an otherwise unremarkable January afternoon in 1937. She was 16 years old. She had slipped out of her typing class at Hollywood High and crossed Sunset Boulevard to have a Coca-Cola at a small soda fountain called the Top Hat Malt Shop, a few steps from the school. While she was sitting there, a man at the next table was watching her. His name was William R. Wilkerson, the publisher and founder of The Hollywood Reporter, one of the most influential trade papers in the entertainment industry. He walked over and asked her if she had ever thought about being in the movies. She told him she would have to ask her mother first. Wilkerson connected her to the talent agent Zeppo Marx, who introduced her to director Mervyn LeRoy, who signed her to a $50 a week contract with Warner Brothers just weeks later. The name Julia Jean Turner was retired. She became Lana Turner, a name she later said she came up with herself, and which she eventually made legally her own. Her first film appearance came later in 1937, in a legal drama called They Won't Forget, in which she played a murdered schoolgirl. She had very little screen time, but she was wearing a tight sweater in the scene, and audiences noticed. The press gave her a nickname, the Sweater Girl, a label she privately disliked for the rest of her career. She was 17 years old, and Hollywood had already decided what she was going to be. Within a few years, she was one of MGM's brightest stars, appearing alongside Clark Gable, and earning a level of fame and income that her childhood in Wallace, Idaho, could not have prepared her for. She was also, by then, deeply lonely in ways that money and recognition did not touch. What happened when Lana Turner first walked into the world of marriage would set the pattern for everything that came after. And the first time was one of the hardest. Marriage 1. Artie Shaw and the education she never forgot. By 1940, Lana Turner was 19 years old and one of the most photographed women in Hollywood. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost aggressive. The platinum hair, the wide eyes, the figure that the studio photographers understood instinctively how to use. She was also, beneath all of it, a young woman who had grown up without much safety, and who wanted, more than she could clearly articulate, someone to love her in a way that felt permanent. The man she chose first was Artie Shaw. Shaw was 30 years old in 1940, a jazz band leader of genuine brilliance and genuine difficulty. He was one of the most successful musicians in the country. His recording of Begin the Beguine in 1938 had made him a household name. And he moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had decided his own intelligence exempted him from ordinary social consideration. He would eventually marry 8 times himself, to women including Ava Gardner and Kathleen Windsor. With Lana Turner, he married first. They eloped in February 1940. It lasted 4 months. Turner later described the marriage as one of the formative, painful experiences of her adult life. Shaw could be contemptuous of her education, her reading, the way she expressed herself. He reportedly told her she was not smart enough and made his disappointment clear in ways that were difficult to forget. She later referred to the experience, with the dark humor that became one of her survival tools, as her college education. What she got out of it, she said, was not happiness, but a thorough lesson in what marriage could do to a person who entered it without their eyes fully open. She left him in September 1940. The divorce was finalized shortly after. She went back to work. She made movies. She gave interviews in which she said careful, diplomatic things about her future and her hope for love. She was 20 years old, and she had already been married and divorced. In the culture of 1940, that was not an easy thing to carry, even for a movie star. It put a particular kind of question mark around her that the press loved to revisit whenever the opportunity arose. What she brought back from that marriage, though, was something she hadn't had before, a harder knowledge of what she was walking into when she said yes to a man. It would not always save her, but it wasn't nothing. In those early 1940s years, Turner's film career accelerated dramatically. She appeared in a string of films for MGM that established her as one of the studio's most reliable leading ladies. Ziegfeld Girl in 1941, Johnny Eager in 1941, Somewhere I'll Find You in 1942, opposite Clark Gable, The Postman Always Rings. Twice in 1946, in which she played a calculating woman caught in a spiral of dangerous desire. That last film was particularly significant. It showed audiences and the industry something they hadn't fully registered before. That underneath the blonde glamour, there was an actress capable of playing women with real interior lives, real hunger, real menace. The film was a massive commercial success, and it gave Turner a kind of credibility she had not quite possessed before. At the same time, the studio system was doing what the studio system always did, packaging her, promoting her, turning her personal life into a feature of her public image. The number of marriages, the famous affairs, the scandals that kept surfacing. MGM's publicity machine managed all of it with practiced efficiency, calibrating how much to suppress and how much to let breathe, depending on what the box office demanded. Turner was not unaware of this. She was not naive about the machinery she was living inside. But she was also, genuinely, someone who kept falling into relationships with real feeling. The publicity machine did not manufacture the longing. That was entirely her own. The second and third marriage to the same man would prove that Lana Turner's relationship with hope was stronger than her relationship with caution. Marriages 2 and 3, Stephen Crane and the daughter in the middle. Joseph Stephen Crane was an actor and tobacco heir from Indiana. He was handsome in an easy, undemanding way, and he did not speak to Lana Turner the way Artie Shaw had. They began seeing each other in 1942, and the relationship moved quickly. They married on July 17th, 1942. Within weeks, a problem surfaced that would have been difficult to invent. Crane, it turned out, had not properly finalized his divorce from his first wife, Carol Ann Kurtz. Under California law, he was still technically married to someone else when he and Lana exchanged vows. The marriage was annulled in February 1943, not because either of them wanted it to end, but because it had never legally existed. By that point, Lana Turner was pregnant. They remarried on March 14th, 1943. Their daughter, Cheryl Christine Crane, was born on July 25th, 1943. For a brief period, it looked as though something might hold, but it did not. The second marriage to Crane ended in divorce in August 1944, just over a year after it began. Crane had struggled to find his footing in the industry, and the relationship could not withstand the pressures of two people trying to build a life from very different starting points. Lana kept custody of Cheryl. She continued working. By the mid-1940s, she was one of the highest-paid actresses in the United States, and her films, including The Postman Always Rings twice in 1946, in which she played a calculating woman caught in a spiral of dangerous desire, were making enormous amounts of money for MGM. She was also, in those same years, falling deeply in love with a man she would never marry. His name was Tyrone Power, the dark-haired, enormously charismatic actor who was considered by many at the time to be the most beautiful man in Hollywood. The two began an affair in the mid-1940s, and those who observed them together said there was something between them that was different from the usual Hollywood entanglement. Turner herself later described Power as the most gentlemanly, enchanting man she had ever known. But Power was still married when the relationship began, and in 1947, Lana discovered she was pregnant with his child. She ended the pregnancy, a decision that, by accounts from people close to her, she carried quietly and painfully for the rest of her life. It was, those closest to her said, a choice driven by the fear of what a public scandal would do to both their careers. In 1948, Power divorced his first wife, and then he married someone else entirely. He did not choose Lana Turner. She was devastated. She would not speak about it publicly for many years, and within months of Power's remarriage, she married again, this time to a man of a very different kind. Marriage number 4 took Lana Turner into the world of old money and high society, and proved that wealth was no substitute for everything she was actually looking for. Marriage 4. Henry Topping and the Millionaire Who Drank. Henry J. Bob. Topping Jr. was a wealthy socialite whose family had made its fortune in tin and steel. He was charming, handsome in a well-fed patrician way, and he moved in circles that Lana Turner's Hollywood success had opened doors to, but not yet made her fully comfortable in. They met while Turner was still reeling privately from the collapse of the Tyrone Power relationship. They married in 1948. It was, on the surface, the kind of match that would have satisfied any number of people's definitions of success. A movie star and a millionaire. A beautiful woman in a beautiful house. They attended events. They were photographed smiling. The image looked right. But the surface was doing a great deal of work. Topping had problems with alcohol and gambling that grew more serious as the marriage progressed. The pattern that emerged was one Turner had not quite encountered in this form before. Not cruelty, exactly, but irresponsibility on a scale that was genuinely difficult to absorb. The bills kept coming. Turner later described having to cover significant financial obligations herself during the marriage, not because Topping had no resources, but because the money kept disappearing into his habits before it reached the household. There were arguments about money, about his drinking, about the direction of a life that had looked so promising in the early months. There was also a pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage. The loss came at a point when the marriage was already strained, and it removed what might have been a reason to try harder to hold things together. Turner dealt with it as she dealt with most painful things, by keeping most of it private, by going back to work, by not allowing the public version of her life to show too much of what was happening in the private one. The marriage lasted until December 1952, when Turner filed for divorce. She was in her early 30s. She had now been through the full cycle of what a difficult marriage looked like in almost every configuration. The brilliant bully, the well-meaning man with the inconvenient previous wife, the wealthy man who couldn't hold himself together. She would later reflect, with characteristic dry self-awareness, that she had been remarkably consistent in her choices and equally consistent in her surprise when things went wrong. Within a year, she was in another relationship, and this time, the consequences would reach much further than the end of a marriage. The 5th marriage, to a man with a Tarzan physique and a secret that would shatter everything, is the one that left marks that never fully faded. Marriage 5. Lex Barker and the secret that broke the family. Lex Barker was an actor best known for playing Tarzan in a series of films throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. He was tall, physically imposing, conventionally handsome, and seemingly straightforward in ways that appealed to Turner after the complications of her previous marriages. They married in September 1953. The marriage lasted 4 years, and by external appearances, it was one of Turner's more stable unions. They attended events together. They were photographed together. The machinery of Hollywood couplehood operated as it was supposed to. But something was happening inside that household that Turner did not speak about publicly until much later, and that her daughter Cheryl addressed directly in her own memoir, published in 1988. Cheryl Crane alleged that during the years of this marriage, she was subjected to inappropriate conduct by Barker, behavior that constituted a serious violation of trust and of her safety in her own home. She was a young girl. He was her stepfather. When Turner discovered what had been happening, her response was immediate and unambiguous. She confronted Barker and, according to multiple accounts, removed him from the home at gunpoint. The marriage ended in divorce on July 22, 1957. No criminal charges were filed at the time. It was a different era, with different expectations about what got reported and what got buried. But the damage to Cheryl was lasting, and the guilt that Turner carried about what had happened in her own house under her watch was something she would wrestle with for years. It was in the shadow of all of this that Lana Turner met Johnny Stompanato. She met him while she was still processing the end of the Barker marriage, still raw, still looking for something, still hoping. Stompanato was 32 years old, handsome in a dark, dangerous way, and connected, through his close association with the gambler and organized crime figure Mickey Cohen, to a world that was very far removed from the studio lots of MGM. He had served in the United States Marines. He was charming when he wanted to be, and when he wanted to be, he was very good at it. Turner later said that in the beginning, she had not known the full extent of his associations. She had known he was not exactly a respectable businessman, but the details of what that meant, the connections, the debts, the violence that could surface without warning, took time to become fully clear. The relationship began in 1957 and almost immediately took on a quality that people around Turner found alarming. Stompanato was consumed by jealousy in a way that went well past ordinary possessiveness. He monitored her. He showed up places he wasn't expected. He made demands on her time, her attention, her movements, in ways that left her increasingly little room to breathe. When she tried to put distance between them, he closed it. When Turner travelled to England in early 1958 to film Another Time, Another Place, opposite a young Sean Connery, Stompanato followed her there uninvited and appeared on the set. The disruption was serious enough that Connery reportedly physically intervened during one confrontation, and British authorities were eventually involved. Stompanato was detained and sent back to the United States. The incident was reported in the press. People around Turner knew at that point what kind of relationship this was. She knew too. But getting out of it was not simple when the person you were trying to leave had made clear what he was willing to do if you tried. What happened on the night of April 4th, 1958, in a Beverly Hills bedroom, is one of the most dramatic and contested moments in Hollywood history, and it changed every life it touched. Good Friday, 1958. The house at 730 North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills was rented. Lana Turner was there that evening, and so was her daughter Cheryl, who was 14 years old. By Turner's own later account, she had decided that night was the night she was ending things. She had learned that Stompanato was not the age he had claimed to be, and it was the kind of discovery that clarified everything she had been avoiding. Stompanato arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening. The argument that followed was fierce enough that Cheryl, in the adjacent room, could hear every word through the walls. It was not the first time she had heard them fight, but this time was different. This time she heard Stompanato making specific, direct threats against her mother, against her grandmother, against Cheryl herself. He reportedly described precisely what he intended to do if Turner did not comply with his demands. According to what Turner told authorities, he produced something capable of causing harm and made clear he intended to use it. Cheryl armed herself with a kitchen knife from downstairs and came back to the bedroom door. The door opened. Stompanato was directly behind Turner. Cheryl later said she does not clearly remember the next few seconds, that they happened faster than memory can hold cleanly. Stompanato moved toward her. The knife made contact. He was stabbed once in the abdomen. The blade was large enough and the wound significant enough that it reached his aorta. He collapsed in the doorway. Turner, who had not seen the knife, initially thought her daughter had struck him with her fist. It was only when she saw blood spreading through his shirt that she understood what had happened. She called for help. By the time anyone arrived with the ability to help him, it was too late. Stompanato was 32 years old when he died. He had been physically threatening Lana Turner for the better part of a year. None of that stopped the press from treating his death as a scandal first and a justifiable act of self-defense second, if at all. The coroner's inquest on April 11th, 1958, drew the kind of public attention that very few legal proceedings outside an actual criminal trial had ever managed. Turner took the stand and gave detailed emotional testimony about the relationship, the threats, and the events of that night. The performance of her grief and fear was dissected in the press with extraordinary unkindness. Some columnists wrote that she was too composed, too theatrical, too much the actress even in moments of genuine human pain. Others wrote that she was clearly a woman who had been living in terror and had finally run out of time. The inquest jury ruled the death a justifiable homicide. Cheryl was exonerated. She spent a brief period in a juvenile detention facility before being released into her grandmother's custody at the end of April 1958. But the machinery of public fascination was not interested in moving on quickly. Stompanato's family, furious at the outcome and the way events were being framed, went to the press. Love letters between Turner and Stompanato, private correspondence that captured the full intensity and chaos of what the relationship had been, were published in newspapers across the country without her consent. Mickey Cohen, Stompanato's employer and associate, held press events and made accusations. The story kept regenerating itself, kept finding new angles, kept pulling Cheryl's name back into the headlines. The teenage girl who had acted to protect her mother became a fixture of tabloid coverage at an age when she should have been doing homework and navigating high school. Turner returned to work. She had to. The bills did not pause for trauma. Her performance in Peyton Place, filmed before the Stompanato killing but released afterward, earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress in 1958. The industry, whatever its private judgments, recognized that she remained one of its most commercially valuable performers. Audiences continued going to her films. The camera still loved her, regardless of what the newspapers said. But the emotional cost of 1958, the accumulated weight of everything that had led to that Good Friday night, and everything that came after it, settled into both Turner and Cheryl in ways that did not resolve quickly. The relationship between them grew more complicated and more strained in the years that followed, fed by guilt and unspoken things, and the difficulty of loving each other across all the damage that had been done. In the years after 1958, Lana Turner kept searching. and the men who came next showed just how little the lessons had changed. Marriages 6, 7, and 8, the last three attempts. By 1960, Lana Turner was 39 years old. The Stompanato affair had not ended her career, but it had changed something about her public image, made it more complicated, more layered, harder to package neatly. She was still beautiful, she was still working, and she was still trying to find, in marriage, the thing she had described wanting for as long as anyone could remember: security and peace. Her sixth husband was Frederick May, a rancher and businessman from New Mexico. They married on November 27, 1960. It was, by most accounts, one of the quieter and more straightforward of her marriages, less obviously volatile, less catastrophically structured. Turner's daughter Cheryl later wrote that May was the husband her mother seemed most genuinely fond of, even after the marriage ended. It ended on October 15th, 1962, less than 2 years after it began. The reasons were never made entirely public, though the strains of two people with very different lives trying to build one together were suggested. May died in 1993, and in the decades between the divorce and his death, he and Turner reportedly maintained a warmer friendship than most of her former marriages allowed for. Marriage 7 came in 1965. Robert Eaton was a film producer, younger than Turner, who had a certain easy confidence about him. They married, and Eaton helped manage some of Turner's business affairs, including her production company, and was involved in producing Madame X in 1966, which turned out to be the last major leading film role of Turner's career. The marriage might have had more time to develop, but it was wrecked by something almost absurdly specific. Eaton had hired a writer named Harold Robbins to work on a television project they were developing together. The problem was that Robbins, some years earlier, had written a best-selling novel called Where Love Has Gone, a book that was widely and openly understood to be a thinly fictionalized account of the Stompanato killing and its aftermath. Turner had been living with the public fascination with that night for nearly a decade. Having her own husband employ the man who had turned it into commercial fiction was more than she was willing to absorb. She quit the television project and filed for divorce. The marriage ended in 1969, after roughly 4 years. And then came the last one. Ronald Peller, who performed under the professional name Ronald Dante, was a nightclub hypnotist. He and Turner met in early 1969. They married in Las Vegas on May 9th, 1969, 3 months after meeting. She was 48 years old. He was not what he appeared to be. Within months of the wedding, Peller disappeared from the marriage in a way that was more than metaphorical. He had, according to Turner, taken approximately $35,000 that she had given him for an investment and used it for something else entirely. She later also accused him of stealing $100,000 worth of her jewelry. Peller denied the accusations. No charges were filed in connection with those specific claims. Turner filed for divorce in January 1970. The divorce was finalized in 1972. It later emerged that Peller had serious legal troubles of his own. He was convicted of attempting to arrange the killing of a rival hypnotist and served time in prison as a result. The details of that particular chapter belonged to a life that Turner, by then, wanted nothing to do with. After the divorce from Peller, Turner said publicly that she was done with marriage. She would later remark, with the self-deprecating humor that had always been one of the more endearing things about her, that she had planned on having 1 husband and 7 children, and it had turned out to be the other way around. But in the years that followed those marriages, something unexpected began to happen. And it involved the one relationship in Lana Turner's life that had survived everything: the later years and the daughter who came back. By the early 1970s, Lana Turner was 50 years old and living a quieter life than any decade prior had suggested she would be capable of. The public performance of her life had always required enormous energy. The events, the photographs, the carefully managed interviews, the maintenance of an image that the industry had built around her, and that she had never quite felt entirely comfortable inside. Now, without a husband to define the narrative, and without a major studio contract dictating her schedule, she moved at a slower pace. She did some television work. A recurring role in the primetime soap opera Falcon Crest in 1982 introduced her to a new generation of viewers who had grown up hearing her name but never watching her films, and the reception was warm. There was something about seeing her again, older, still beautiful in a different way, still commanding the camera with that particular ease that audiences genuinely responded to. She published her autobiography, Lana, the Lady, the Legend, the Truth, in 1982, in which she addressed her life with a level of candor that surprised some readers and left others wishing she had gone further. She was selective, as she had always been. She told the parts of the story she was ready to tell. She kept the parts she wasn't. She spoke in those years about her faith, about learning to sit with stillness in a way that had been impossible during the decades of constant motion. She talked about the importance of laughter, about how she had used humor as a genuine survival mechanism through things that might otherwise have been unbearable. These were not performances. They were the observations of someone who had arrived, finally, at a kind of self-knowledge that the younger version of herself had been too busy trying to fill the silence to develop. In 1988, Cheryl published her own memoir, Detour, a Hollywood story. It was honest, sometimes uncomfortably so, about what it had been like to grow up as Lana Turner's daughter, about the Lex Barker years, and the way her mother had responded when she found out the truth, about the night of Good Friday 1958, and what the years that followed had cost her, about the periods of distance and difficulty between them. It was not a comfortable book for Turner to read, but talking about the things it contained, working through them together finally, turned out to be part of what brought them back to each other rather than pushing them further apart. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, mother and daughter were closer than they had ever been. Turner was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1992. The disease was serious and progressed without pause. Cheryl was there through all of it. She took care of her mother with a devotion that spoke to everything the two of them had managed to repair across all the difficult years between them. Lana Turner died on June 29th, 1995, at her home in the Century City neighborhood of Los Angeles. She was 74 years old. Cheryl was beside her at the end. 8 marriages, 7 men. A career that stretched across nearly 5 decades and produced films still watched today. A scandal that became the most talked-about criminal case in Hollywood since the silent era. A daughter whose own life was shaped at every turn by the choices and circumstances that surrounded being Lana Turner's child. She had come from absolutely nothing. A murdered father. A mother working 80 hours a week. Foster homes she was not safe in. A small town in Idaho that barely exists on maps anymore. And from all of that, she had built something extraordinary, not because the industry asked her to, but because she was tougher than anyone looking at the platinum hair and the MGM lighting had any reason to assume. The marriages were real. The longing was real. The damage was real. What is also real, and worth saying, is that she kept going. Through the Artie cruelty and the Stephen Crane complications, and the topping disintegration, and the Lex Barker horror, and the Stompanato nightmare, through all of it, she got up and went back to work and made more films and tried again. Not because she was reckless exactly, but because the alternative, for Lana Turner, was a kind of giving up that was simply not in her nature. The world she became famous in has been gone for decades. The studio system, the contract stars, the particular machinery of mid-century Hollywood glamour, all of it dismantled and replaced by something else entirely. But the films she made in those years have not gone anywhere. The Postman Always Rings Twice still holds up. Peyton Place still lands. And the image of the sweater girl, the reluctant pin-up who never quite trusted the image being sold to the world under her name, still circulates. She spent her whole life looking for security and peace. She said it herself, more than once, without embarrassment. She found it, finally, in the last years she had left. And not in a marriage, in a daughter who had come back. That is the part of the story that deserves to be remembered alongside all the rest. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.